Hello, Dr. Maya Kinzigler of Monarch Family Chiropractic. Welcome to the workshop. We are talking about kids and chiropractic. A lot of times when talking about chiropractic, when we're outside of the realm of pain, there's a huge misconception or a misunderstanding as to why chiropractic would be a great modality to use, whether it's for health and well-being, whether it's for kids, whether it's for animals. And so tonight's conversation is really to help you understand why we would recommend you getting your kiddos checked. Because it's vital, right? It's so much easier to support a healthy, growing brain and body than it is to address decades of stress, 40, 50, 60 years in, right? And a lot of times, as we'll get into tonight, what happens in the first 1,000 days of life is critical. But before we get there, I first want to just talk about how our body works. And we do that through what we call the safety pin cycle. And I just want you to think about this. So if we're looking at this first safety pin here, okay, the easiest way for us to really give you a simple understanding of how your brain and body work is if you have this brain up top here and your body is the circle on the bottom. Understand that you have this feedback mechanism of what's called efferent and afferent input for your brain to constantly be in understanding of what's going on with the body, and the body in also constant communication of what's understanding what's going on with the brain. So what happens is you have this input from the brain to the body, which is an efferent or motor response, and you have this afferent or sensory input into the brain, which is the sensory or sensation input, okay? And so if you think about any type of symptom that you could be experiencing, right? Anywhere from restriction or tightness of a range of motion or poor flexibility. If you think of a challenge with balance or a perception of where you believe the stairs to be, right? Haven't we sometimes taken steps and we faltered because, we didn't realize the stair was further away or closer. We can have pain, right? We can have headaches. We can have digestive changes. All of those are information that our body is giving us that there's stress to this efferent and afferent loop, okay? Now, the biggest way our brain has in terms of sensory input, all of our sensations, everything we see, everything we hear, everything we feel, right? Smell and taste, all of that is feeding information into the brain. That's what our brain has to process our world. The sixth sensory input is proprioception. Okay, proprioception is my hand behind my back. I know it's there, not because I can taste it or not because I can feel it, but because, I just know. That is proprioception. Your brain understanding where your body is in space, that is the sixth sense. So a couple things. You have all of this sensory input that helps your brain process things. Now, one of the largest sensory input stimulation is our vision. So what we see, and you can just try this with me at home. If you are standing, at home, and I want you to go on one foot, and I want you to close your eyes, okay? And I want you to experience what that feels like in your body when you close your eyes. Does it impact how you are balancing? Do you get clumsy or feel uncertain on your feet, right? Your brain is using sensory input as a major information into the brain to help process things. And a lot of times when we take that visual output or visual input out, then it impacts how our brain gathers other information to help process our world. So what happens, right? We start taking this visual input out, And then we start to move, right? A lot of people start to, move their body. The other big, huge sensory input that our brain uses to process our world is movement. In fact, that is the primary sensation or sensory input that our brain uses for processing our world. Okay, so movement and appropriate movement is hugely important in day-to-day life, but also in the development of a brain and nervous system when we look at our kiddos. Okay, we'll get there in a second. So let's just go back to our safety pin cycle. So know that your brain is constantly in communication with your body, right? It is this constant loop that is taking place, that is always and forever talking to each other. And if there's any type of interference, if there's any type of stress to this loop, we call that a subluxation, meaning the safety pin is not used as it's meant to. There is a disconnect, and the information going to the brain is lessened, is challenged, right? We call that a subluxation. So when we talk about adjustments to correct the subluxation in chiropractic, we're literally reconnecting this loop to your safety pin, right? So I want to show you a couple flyers that I downloaded so that you can get an idea of where we're going with the kiddos. Let me just get there first. Let's exit out. Go here. And I want to go to, sorry guys, thanks for your patience here. There we go. So let's open up this. Okay, so I want you to see this because most moms are aware that a way to really gauge how their kiddo is developing, how their brain is doing, is through milestones, right? Milestones are those expected outcomes that we should see as a child ages, okay? An example would be a child who is able to lift their head, right? By a certain age, we want to see is a kiddo lifting their head. Because if they don't have head control, that tells us that there's something going on that's hindering brain development, and there could be a problem if it continues and it's not addressed, okay? So let's go back to movement. Or let's talk about these first 1,000 days. The first 1,000 days are critical to brain development, and that's starting at conception. If there's any impacts or stresses within these first 1,000 days, it could be catastrophic, well, significantly detrimental to continued brain development and growth. I wanted to give you an example. There are windows in brain development in these first 1,000 days that if we miss those windows, it'll never happen again. An example I like to give is it's called neuronal migration. So it's where neurons will migrate to different areas of the brain as it branches out and grows. I want you to think about a neuron like an oak tree, right? All those neurons are the roots of the system. And a neuron is a brain cell. So the way the brain cells, talk to each other is neuron to neuron, right? So you have these huge oak trees made up of one neuron. We've got billions of neurons within our brain. So that branching out needs to happen as we develop and grow, right? And think about a cat, right? A cat is born, a little kitten is born. How quickly do they walk? How quickly are they standing on their feet and starting to walk, right? I mean, it is pretty quick. If they don't do it right away, then we know something's wrong. How quickly does it take for a human kiddo to walk, right? Typically it takes a year. So what is happening in that 0 to 12-month time frame? Why does it take us so long to get our crap together to walk? And that's because your brain is developing. It develops like a flower. It develops inside out, from bottom to top, right to left, back to front. And it is a very specific process that we see happen over time. So, neuronal migration. I'll give you an idea. If you are a neuron and you're migrating to a different area of the brain, a neurologist that I listened to, this is how she described it. It's like, if I'm the neuron, I have to get on a specific bus, but not just any bus. It is a bus that's going to a very specific destination, right? Once I get on the bus, I'm not done yet. I have to sit down, not just in any seat, but in a very specific seat, right? And not only that, but I have to sit beside a very specific person. And that person has to be wearing a red shirt, right? So this is neuronal migration. It is very specific. It happens at a very specific time. And if you miss your bus, guess what? That migration doesn't happen. That's how important these first 1,000 days of life are. Critical for brain development. And the most important thing that our brain has in terms of development is movement. How our system is moving, right? Where our brain understands how our body is moving in space to get input into the brain for this brain to develop and grow, okay? Now, you've all heard of primitive reflexes. If you're a mom, you definitely have. But primitive reflexes are reflexes that are ingrained within our brain. They're in our brain stem. It's the most primitive, most sophisticated tool we have as a toddler, as a kiddo, to function and survive in life, but they are primitive, right? And so an example would be your rooting reflex, right? If you take your finger and you go right across the cheek on a newborn, it's called your rooting, they're going to turn to you, right? It's a rooting reflex. And guess what? This is the most sophisticated tool they have to find food, right? They're turning to find their mom's breast to suckle. Guess what? We have more sophisticated tools at this point to find food, I hope. But as we go through brain development, this goes away as we learn to feed ourselves in other ways. Now, I want you to understand how rooted these reflexes are within our body. The sucking reflex that we learn to suck for as we're breastfeeding, we start doing that in utero at 20 weeks. Sit with that for a second. So by the time we're born at 37, 38, 39, 40 weeks, we've already been using this reflex for almost 20 weeks. So if we have any tongue tie issues, meaning we have at the bottom of our tongue or in our lip, we've got tied so we don't have proper movement of the lips or proper movement of the tongue. That means we've got a reflex that we've been practicing for 20 weeks where we go to latch on mom and we're not getting the appropriate, we're not latching appropriately or we can't feed. And we got to do these things, these outside stimulus to address that or remove the tongue tie. We wonder, well, why is it such a big deal? They were just born, right? But guess what? These primitive reflexes are integrated within our bodies, within our nervous systems before we're even born, right? So making sure these primitive reflexes are integrated appropriately into the body is vital, and it happens within the first year of life. And so with primitive reflexes, we've got this rooting reflex. We've got, the startle reflex. If you ever take a baby and you drop them quickly, right? They startle. That's a reflex. If you run your finger along the bottom of a foot, that's a reflex. You run it on, pushes their foot forward. All of these are reflexes or physical stimulus into a body to support your child going through proper brain development. It is so important that this happens. Okay, so let's go back to this chart here. So This is a year one quick screen of what we should see in terms of brain development, right? So in the first month of life, we should start seeing movements. And as brain development occurs, we should see movements that take place that are more sophisticated in nature, right? Now I want to show you something. I want to make sure you can see this. It is vital that these happen. So vital. They happen in an order, right? We don't just go from like, army crawl to running or skipping, right? We go from, lifting our head, and we start army crawl, or we're wiggling, right? Then we start army crawling, and then we start getting up on all fours and rocking, and then we start, crawling, and then we start to sit up, then we start to stand, and then we start taking our first couple steps, right? It is a process. You are literally witnessing a kiddo brain develop, okay? Now, if that doesn't happen in that way, and we see things like this, right? Have you ever seen a kiddo who is crawling, scooting on their butt, only using one side compared to the other? That's a problem. We think it's cute. We think it's funny. It's not cute. I mean, sure, anything a baby does is cute, but this is actually a window into their brain to see, oh, something's not right in terms of how their brain's developing, and they need different types of input to help support that brain development. You guys can see this, right? Jen or Lena, give me a thumbs up or a.
Yes, I can see that clearly.
Oh, okay. Yes, okay, awesome, thank you. So this is a very, I can't even tell you, when we see this type of presentation, crawling is vital. Typically, I tell people, we want a kiddo to be crawling for 4 months before they're walking. Because what happens when you engage the top half of the body and the lower half of the body, the right side of the body and the left side and the right side of the body, it engages the brain in every way to get really appropriate input into and help with neurodevelopment. Because ultimately, we want these primitive reflexes to get integrated into the system. And if they're not, then we have areas where we get stuck in terms of how we develop and how we respond to and process our world. Now, recently, you maybe have heard this, but the CDC just extended their guidelines for milestones. And they actually said that crawling isn't even an important milestone. I mean, I am concerned when our health agencies are changing the screening process, because what does it mean if these things aren't happening? It means that you have potentially behavioral issues down the road. And typically by 6 months, we can identify if a child is showing sensory or neuroprocessing disorders like autism, like ADD, ADHD. But if you look at traditional healthcare, they will not diagnose a kiddo with autism until they're 3 years old. So you're talking about 0 to 3 years. That's a big time frame. You can address some things in that time frame. That's huge neurodevelopmental stuff that takes place that needs to be addressed. So I want you to think about this. If there's a kiddo that's going through this brain development, and movement is hugely important, right? For your brain to get appropriate stimulus. If you have a head tilt, right? If you have a head tilt and your brain is going through development, how do you think that impacts how your brain is processing the world? How do you think that impacts your brain growth, right? So if you have postural distortions within your structure as your brain is going through development, and we see a head tilt, that can skew your world entirely. So it's a big problem if we see these things take place, because it's not just, this is foundational. This is foundational stuff. It's foundation for the brain. So if the gaps aren't filled in this time frame, then it just continues to carry on later in life, right? So you need to fill the gaps and help with appropriate input into the brain so the brain can go through that proper development. And when you have some of these neurosensory and processing disorders, we see kids who are 13, 14, 15, who are literally responding or functioning at a 4 or 5-year-old, right? But they're just bigger kids, but their brain is at a 4 or 5-year-old, right? So we're looking at how can we address and give appropriate input into the brain to help support the brain go through healthy development. And if there's any areas that didn't happen with gross motor function, right? That's body movement, fine motor function, that's holding a pencil, it's more fine motor, right? We can identify if there's any indicators of how a kiddo's behaving or how they carry themselves. We can start to identify where gaps in development took place, maybe what didn't happen in this, quick screen here. Oh, sorry, this is upside down. And we can start to address it. Because when we see behavioral stuff taking place with kiddos, it's just a window into their brain, right? Typically, it's not a behavior thing. It's not like your kid turned 4, 5, and 6, and then suddenly they're a bad kid at 6 years old, right? It's really how they're doing in terms of brain function, how they can process their world. Now, here's a big thing. At 5 and 13, 5 is typically when kiddos go to school. 13, there's shifts that happen in the brain, and we look at the demands on school. But what's required in school doesn't always reflect what's going on with the brain. So at 5 and 13, we typically see school jumps to the brain, asking the brain to process things where the brain's not there neurodevelopmentally. And so we see kids acting out. We see kids acting out. We see typical behavioral stuff show up at 5 and 13 years old because there's been an increased demand on their world, but their brain isn't processing to handle that demand. And so it's not that we have a bad kid, it's that we have a kid who's just not developmentally there, which is most kids, which is all kids, because our education system is not addressing where brain development is as opposed to where we're teaching. And so, I guess I'm just, if you're noticing a kiddo who's acting out, you said, man, they've never acted like this. Typically, it's a window into what's going on with the brain and how they process things. So by the time a kid is 4 or 5 years old, it's estimated that they've had around 4,000 to 5,000 impacts to their spine and structure. And again, we look at how does the brain develop? How does the brain get its information? It is through movement. So if you have poor movement, if you have lack of movement, if you don't have movement at all, right? You see in postural distortions, that means the information feeding the brain and how the brain can really process our world is skewed. And we see that sometimes behaviorally with acting out, with meltdowns, with tantrums, with tendencies to really focus on, a specific behavior or action. And that's all a window into how the brain's working. And we go back to, how did development occur and where is a kiddo stuck in terms of, helping support, getting appropriate input to move them along in the process. So the last thing I'm going to end here is with, I'm going to show you this list here. I don't think I have a mic on this computer. So if you guys have questions or you want some clarity on things, if you just want to write it in the chat, because unfortunately, I picked the wrong computer to do this with. I'm sad because I want to talk to both of you. But in the office this week, we're talking about the 3 T's. They're the primary causes of subluxation: traumas, toxins, and thoughts. When it comes to a kiddo, we can create the perfect storm, meaning we can create the perfect scenario of a combination of stressors that the output or the product of that will be a kiddo who does not appropriately process their world, or a kiddo who is having trouble processing their world, which can look like ADD, ADHD tendencies. It could look like acting out. It could look like a lot of things. So when we look at the three T's and really assess the health of a kiddo, we look at, okay, what do the traumas look like? What did the birth look like? Were there any interventions? Was there a traumatic birth? And then what did childhood look like, right? Were there any major falls or accidents? And if there were any falls or accidents, where in that time frame did that happen? Did it happen earlier on or later in life? And we can sometimes pinpoint if there's gaps or stress related to where in brain development they were. We can pinpoint that and help address that. Toxins, that's the chemical component. So were there any antibiotics or medications introduced early on? Vaccines is a hot topic, but you've got to look at if we're injecting children directly into the blood with, a vaccine, not just one, but multiple of them. What's that chemical load, that stress load on a system where your immune system is not fully developed, right? That's a stressor. May not be a big deal, but if you add all these other stressors, it becomes a big deal. What are the kiddos eating? Do they have healthy air and healthy environment to live in? All of that can contribute to that. And then we've got the thoughts piece, the mental piece, right? COVID is a prime example. We've been wearing masks. We're requiring kiddos to wear masks. And kiddos are scared to be around other people, scared to be around, their grandpa and grandma, because they're scared of what they could give them, right? The lifestyle of being a kid and then handling social situations and school, there's a lot happening with a kiddo. So you can have these three T's that all impact, the health and the development of a brain and a nervous system, health and development of a body. And typical early warning signs that these three categories of stress has impacted the brain and nervous system are right here, right? Colic and sleep issues. We see reflux, constipation, nursing difficulties, ear infections. We see all of these things can happen. And what becomes, acute leads to more of a chronic situation. So when we see an uptick of neurodevelopmental stuff like ADD, ADHD, autism, anxiety is a huge one. Anxiety is an inability to, control our world, inability to predict what's going to happen. And we're seeing it more and more with kiddos, right? I don't know about you, Lena. I know you're more where I grew up in terms of time frame, and anxiety wasn't a thing growing up for me, but it's a thing now, not just for adults, but it's a thing for a lot of kids too. And so we look at those behavioral pieces. We've got to look at what's going on with the brain. How is the brain processing things? And if there was any stress during those developmental years, then that means that stress impacted today how we process, and you can fill the gaps in there, but it takes time and it takes the appropriate input. So I hope this provided you with just a better picture as to why we want kiddos getting chiropractic care, because ultimately, when we look at the movement piece, right, is there appropriate movement? That's where chiropractors go to the spine, right? That's that subluxation. If there is malalignment, if there is lack of movement, no movement, abnormal movement, that interferes with that input going into the brain. And then it interferes with how it processes and that output, right? So with chiropractic, we are all about that safety pin cycle, because ultimately when you are better connected and you have appropriate movement at the spinal level, that means the brain is better able to process things because it's getting good information in and better able to get information out. And that leads to a healthy, growing kid, right? It's a big deal. So I appreciate you guys being here with me. And I look forward to, your questions. I didn't have really great pictures today, but it was, I think, an important conversation. So